We have this case before the Supreme Court on taxation, potentially with a lot of ramifications. Explain to us exactly what is at stake in the Moore case. How did we get here?
Well, thanks so much for having me on, David. And honestly, this is the most important tax case that the Supreme Court has considered in decades. The particular provision is a pretty obscure provision of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that levied taxes on American taxpayers with ownership stakes in foreign corporations. The petitioners in this case are a couple. They're a couple named the Moores, who are contesting their $15,000 tax bill for a stake that they had in an agriculture company that's headquartered in India called Kizencraft. Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the companies that had foreign profits that were accumulated abroad and U.S. taxpayers that had ownership stakes in those companies, they never faced tax consequences until those profits were repatriated to the U.S. As a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it was a broad-based set of provisions that included very significant tax cuts across the board, for example, for corporations who saw tax rates fall from like 35% to 21%. And so the drafters of the legislation, they were trying to look for ways to offset some of those revenue losses. And imposing a tax in this case was one of the solutions that they came to. They didn't have in their mind the Moores, whose $15,000 tax bill is kind of small dollars relative to what was happening by large profitable corporations who were using the fact that they didn't have to pay taxes on these type of stakes to stash profits abroad and avoid taxation. And so like Apple owed $38 billion from this tax. Google owed $10 billion. Microsoft owed $18 billion. What the Moores are doing in this case is they're challenging the constitutionality of whether or not this tax should have been allowed to be levied at all by claiming that they never realized any income in this case. Of course, obviously they did because they owned a foreign corporation that saw very significant profits.
Well, you used a really important word there, realized the income, because as I understand it, the foreign corporation did not write a check to the Moores. They didn't actually get money in their bank account. And you pointed out there's a constitutional issue here. There's a 16th Amendment that was enacted specifically for income tax. Is it income if I don't get the money, if it stays in the corporation?
So, David, that is, in fact, at the crux of this case. And you said all of the sort of relevant legal aspects here. The 16th Amendment allows for, their Constitution places some limits on Congress's ability to levy taxes. One of the limits is that those taxes have to be apportioned proportionally across the states. But the income tax, the 16th Amendment provides an exception to that limit for the purposes of income. And so the question in this case, what the case really turns on, is this income? Was this income realized? And the reason why this case is so important is not because of overall the revenue consequences of this case. They're significant. That's about $340 billion of revenue over the course of a decade, coming again, like nearly all of it, from large profitable corporations, not from individuals like the Moores. The revenue consequences, that's pretty significant money, but it's like small dollars relative to what's at stake in the rest of the code, which operates exactly as this provision does. So when you think, for example, about partnership stakes or S corporations, where taxation is levied not at the entity level, but definitionally we call them pass-throughs, right? Because the income is passed through to the individual who has that ownership stake. Or when you think about subpart F of the tax code, which is exactly about ownership stakes, investment income in foreign corporations, which was levied in order to prevent individuals and corporations from being able to have investment income that accumulates abroad just for the purposes of avoiding U.S. taxation. We have designed aspects of the code in exactly the manner that this provision operates. And so the consequences here are the conservative right-leaning tax foundation has estimated that an extreme ruling in this case could cost $6 trillion over the course of a decade because it would throw the entire tax code into a shroud of uncertainty. And that's why Speaker Paul Ryan, who actually sort of drafted the legislation and is intimately familiar with this particular case. That's why he's heavily focused on the fact that this case is a misfire from a constitutional perspective, because there's no real question here. In this case, income was very clearly realized. And here we have a case just like Subpart F, just like pass-throughs, where taxation is levied at individuals for their ownership stakes.
So, Professor, you mentioned partnerships and Subchapter S, pass-through corporations. Talk about a regular corporation. I own stock in GM, let's say, and they have retained earnings that they do not distribute to me as a dividend. They don't buy back the stock. Theoretically, could Congress tax that income to me that GM is not distributing?
So an important, and you're kind of raising what ends up being a pretty important set of issues for this case, even though I want to be clear that they're distinct. The groups that are behind the Moores, that are the conservative advocacy groups that are pushing this case, what they are really after is not Section 965 of Subpart F, this particular provision of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. What they are focused on is trying to have the Supreme Court preemptively weigh in on taxation, like on other means of taxation of unrealized capital gains. For example, through schemes like wealth taxation or through a direct mark-to-market tax of unrealized capital gains. Think if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you have your stake in Meta that's appreciated very significantly over the course of your lifetime, that's like your wealth. And so can we tax that wealth in this manner?